finish modernist art today through pop art, and then we're going to take a quiz over early modern and modern art on Wednesday first thing, right? And so when we finish, if we finish, we're going to actually start postmodernism. So I'll make sure that I delineate for you guys in your head when, you know, what the information for this quiz is versus the next quiz. And we'll see how far we get through that. Because I want to make sure we get as much time to study for the AP exam as possible in the class. It seems like right now we're going to have a little bit like a week and a half. We'll have like a week and a half to study in class. Okay, so last week we looked at abstract expressionism. And what we start with today is going to be kind of reminiscent of that abstract expressionism. So I want to make sure that I do a good job explaining this and reviewing this with you guys again, because we kind of went over it quickly. But abstract expressionism is often called the New York School. This is the first real art movement established in the United States outside of anything indigenous, right? It's the first kind of like modern art movement that started in the United States. And it's often considered to be a term used for abstract painting, such as the work of Jackson Pollock, right, Mark Rothko, and William de Kooning. And so remember that we have William de Kooning in our image set, right? So we have the women's series where he did about 6 of these paintings of these kind of monstrous women. And the major characteristics of this art form is that they have these large gestural brushstrokes and mark making. So what do I mean by that? You see the application of the paint. You see how the artist added it to the canvas. So work like de Kooning and Pollock have these really broad, expressive brushstrokes. And I was taught in art history that these are big canvases with big emotions. And so this is the artist throwing up their emotions on the canvas. Sorry, that was crude, right? But it's all about big emotions and getting out your emotions. And these artists were very inspired by psychology. They were inspired by the automatism of surrealism. This is that idea of just letting you kind of paint and go with the flow and then trying to make something of it. So there's this sense of improvisation with a lot of these pieces as well, okay? And so contextually, thinking about history, this is a rejection of the very minimal abstraction that was taking place in Europe. So people like Mondrian, remember how clean and pristine that version of abstraction is? This is like messy abstraction. Messy abstraction. And then again, like I mentioned, it really is rooted in European surrealism. Right, so it's an American movement coming out of a reaction against abstract expression, or excuse me, abstract minimalism, like Mondrian and Steele, and the influences of automatism in surrealism. Okay, and this is all post-World War II. There's a lot of like Jungian society influences on this too. So the second generation of painters are also called sometimes post-painterly extraction. And these artists were also kind of have a range of styles that kind of evolved from the gestural approach, so that mark-making approach of the abstract expressionists. They often use really bright color, but they also lack detail, and they often too work very, very large. A lot of this post-painterly abstraction is really tied with that emotional color field painting like Mark Rothko, and how color can create emotion. And there's really 2 different veins of this. There's that color field painting and then hard edge abstraction. And we have a color field painting in our image set, which is called The Bay by Helen Frankenthaler. Right, so number 149 is called The Bay. So how is her work similar to other abstract expressionist works? What is similar about her work? Can anyone help me out? Varun, can you help me?
I'm not really sure.
So we just talked about all those characteristics of abstract expressionism. Is there any of those that we just talked about that you see in this one? So if I go back to that other slide, all right? Can anyone help them out? So these are very large, these were typically pretty large paintings, and they were extremely abstract. So they're on the verge of non-representation. She called this the Bay, but she really didn't necessarily have a subject matter from this painting. We'll talk about that in a little bit. They have large areas of color. So just like Mark Rothko, they have large areas of color, and it lacks detail. So when you look at the Bay, it's not like you can say, oh, that looks just like a water map. It kind of feels like it could be water, but we're not necessarily sure. Kind of looks like more like a topographical map in a way. It has this open composition. So what that basically means is it kind of is arbitrary, kind of goes where it wants to go. And it was based on a non-traditional painting style. We'll talk about that in just a second. How is it different? It's all about the process. So here you can see Frankenthaler working, right? She would water down paint and pour it onto the canvas. So she did not apply it with a paintbrush. So like Jackson Pollock is flicking, right, the paint. Rothko would have painted with a paintbrush to let the transparency show. And then of course the Kooning would have painted and scraped and layered and painted and scraped and layered and so on. What she used is raw canvas. So what I mean by that is there's no primer on this canvas, okay? So most canvases, when you buy them, have a primer on them that's kind of white. What she would do is she would use raw canvas. So have you ever spilled something like coffee or tea or a colored beverage on fabric and watched it spread, right? The same sort of effect would happen here. When she would liquefy her paint and pour it on this, it would seep and create blurry edges. It gave it kind of an ethereal sort of quality to it, right? So she was using this new technique of pouring the paint, either acrylic, which is latex-based, it's like plastic-based, the new media that really happened in the 1900s, or she would use oil paint that she would thin down with like turpentine, and she would paint it. She was one of the very few women working in abstract expressionism. Outside of Lee Krasner, who was married to Jackson Pollock, it was really a boys' club. There were these big canvases, you know, they were big, full emotions. They were manly men, like Jackson Pollock killed himself, actually got in a car accident by drinking heavily after like a poker date. So these guys were kind of like notoriously like party animals, big personalities, and kind of full of macho-ness. And so a lot of the collectors and the galleries were kind of looking for these big personality men, and she was a woman working in this world. So she was popular in her own day. This picture that you see here on the bottom is based on a spread that was done in Life magazine on her as a woman working in a man's world. So what is her imagery, right? What is her imagery? So the colors in the paintings don't necessarily have to represent anything in particular. And that is something that is pretty much rooted in abstract expressionism. It kind of goes back to the last comment that you see here on this page, is that it was important for her that we take away our own interpretation of the painting. That she makes it, she experiences it, but she wants us to also experience it in our own way. We should personalize it, right? So that's one thing, right? It's not representational, and that she wants it to, each person who sees it, to get across their own emotion, right? Or their own interpretation of what it's about. However, it is based on a series of paintings, and she named them all kind of after water. So there's things like canal, low tide, new tide. And she said that the series was inspired by where she grew up. So she grew up in Provincetown, Massachusetts. So there is a little bit of storytelling taking place, but for most of her work, she wants you to interpret it the way that you interpret it. So the color and the simplicity of it is supposed to show that pure emotion of her, and then your emotional reaction. A little cerebral, right? A lot of these artists were really interested in Jungian psychology and tapping into the unconscious and kind of creating these universal languages that everyone can understand. So here's some more Frankenthalers. You can see how they bleed, how the paint kind of feels uncontrolled in a way. They have, contrasting colors, sort of like Matisse, Fox, right? There's a fluidity to them because of how she pours the canvas. Now this is kind of the opposite of this. This is hard edge abstraction. There's a series like Kelly and an artist named Kelly who were kind of going back to Mondrian in a way. So of course, abstract expressionism kind of was a rejection of Mondrian, and then eventually there's a rejection of all that big emotion and messiness of abstract expressionism. And so we get these hard edge abstraction artists. And so they would create things that were really clean and pristine. And these canvases too are enormous, enormous. So they used really bright, vivid color, very, very abstract, non-representational. Paintings like this would cover the entire gallery wall. Some of them, this is another Kelly. Who is this? This is Frank Stella. I apologize, Frank Stella. And he actually would change the shape of the canvases. So these little corners are niches, and that's an opening in the canvas. And he used iridescent paint so that they would shiver. So they kind of change the shape. So this is like 4 V's kind of compiled together. So once again, this is negative space. The canvas is irregular in shape. Okay. That's the wheel of death here. Sorry, on my map. Oh, there we go. So chevron shapes. Okay. And then of course we also have minimalism coming back. So minimalism comes back where they kind of remove the touch of the artist. This once again is a rejection of the messiness of abstract expressionism. It really doesn't have any sort of element of an artist's touch. It looks like everything is machine made or factory made. This is Donald Judd. He makes a series of sculptures made out of industrial materials. So things like stainless steel, plexiglass, and he plays on light. And so when the light shine on these, you see reflections of different colors. The Art Institute has a really nice example of this in their modern section. So it's very clean, very pristine. So this is like colored plexiglass. Here's like an entire gallery filled of these cubes. Right? And then we have some large outdoor sculptures. You've probably seen these things on major university campuses, major cities, out in parks. So large sculptural pieces. This is stainless steel. And it feels like it's gonna topple over, right? So it's welded together, so it couldn't possibly. So there's this sense of kind of like irregular balance to it. And then we start to see people using found materials once again in sculpture. This is the artist Eva Hess. This is a piece that she has at the Art Institute called Hang Up. And it's kind of this blending of sculpture and painting. It's as if this painting on the wall is like coming out into our space. She was European, she was German actually, and she would scrounge up a lot of the materials in old factories that had been abandoned after World War II. So this kind of leads us to this kind of transitional period. So in between abstract expressionism and pop art, we have a group of artists like Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, who were kind of moving away from the imagery that's rooted in abstract expressionism. So we can kind of see back like the resurgence of imagery. So when we look at this Jasper Johns on the left, right, on the left, it's an iconic image, correct? Right? You look at it and it's not just abstract, you notice it as the American flag. And then this image that's on the right side is that painting / sculpture called Bed, right? And this is where Robert Rauschenberg used a bed and a quilt and he hung it on a canvas. So we have the resurgence of representational imagery, but they do it in a very abstract expressionist method. So this is all painted in caustic. You guys might remember encaustic from our early ancient period, where artists would paint with melted colored waxes. And so this has collage elements in it where you can see text kind of coming through in different areas, and then the colored wax is applied on top. So you can read the imagery behind it as well as the iconic imagery of the American flag. So he used a lot of recognizable symbols like our flag. He would eliminate the color. So like, what does that mean? Why would he change the color? This is a protest piece that he did around Vietnam. It's one of those scientific kind of things too, where if you stare at it long enough and then move your eye, you can actually see the American flag. You know, your eye will see the red, white, and blue and on a white surface. He used things like targets. These are all casts of his own face. And then he would recall imagery from his childhood that you might see in kindergarten or in elementary school, so numbers and letters. And he famously, you know, in their own lifetime, a lot of these abstract expressionists and post-abstract expressionists, they were making big money. So I mentioned that the galleries were like, you know, really thriving in New York City and selling these really large pieces. And Jasper John says that he could probably sell anything for like $1 million. He could sell anything for an obscene amount of money. So he actually took a beer can and casted it in bronze, and it did sell at the at an auction. So it was, or at a gallery. So he could really sell anything for an exorbitant amount of money. Right? So Robert Rauschenberger is another artist who really is interested in kind of breaking the rules of art. Not only was he a sculptor / painter, but he also was a performance artist. And so we'll get a chance to look at a little performance art, hopefully even one today, where they would kind of act out scenarios and have audience sort of participation as well. He was friends with John Cage, who maybe you've heard about John Cage before. He notoriously did a series of musical numbers. And I think one, I should have gotten the name of it. But basically what happened is he basically went out onto a piano and sat there for like 4 minutes without playing a note. And that was his performance piece, the absence of the music, right? And so Rauschenberg was a friend of his. And so Rauschenberg would do kind of like abstract expressionist painting in kind of like sculptural collage form. So this is called like obelisk. And so it's a play on obelisk and obelisk, the Turkish harem girls. He used a lot of found objects that you can get at resale shops. And so like taxidermy. Okay, so we're gonna move into pop because this really is moving into pop. Even Jasper John is kind of looking at popular culture with the American flag and all these iconic sort of symbols. And so that leads us to what we call pop art and how it challenges tradition, right? So one of the very first pop pieces actually comes out of England. This is Hamilton. And when you look at his work, you'll see that there are a lot of images based on popular culture, right? So pop art is a reaction against abstract expressionism and all of those Jackson Pollock imitators. It's a return to pictorial images, right? So we see the, representational images coming back. Often images are of everyday objects or things that come from popular or mass culture. So things that are famous people, common everyday products, common everyday objects. It's kind of a natural stage that came from synthetic cubism and Dada, where you would bring non-art objects and materials and make them highbrow, make them fine art. You can sort of see Robert Rauschenberg was doing that with Ben and with Dada and whatnot. Pop art is often thought of to be about kind of this optimistic spirit of the 1960s before counterculture and a lot of the political kind of unrest of the late 60s, early 70s. And it starts, like I said, in England, but it really becomes a very, most people think of it as being an American movement. And they use a lot of commercial techniques in the art form. So what do I mean by commercial techniques? The way that we print newspapers or make advertisement, they would use a lot of these design-oriented techniques in order to make their artworks. And so we'll talk about that in terms when we look at Andy Warhol today. So in postmodernism, which is what we're moving to, so we're in modern art, and the next stage is postmodern. Pop art is kind of like a border, right? Kind of in between. So we start to see tendencies that will be established in postmodernism happening in pop art. And one of those concepts is appropriation. We've seen appropriation before, where basically people borrow imagery from other artists or other cultures. We've seen people taking something throughout history and copying and mimic the style or the content of other artists. Remember how Manet was doing that all the time? And he was updating famous works of art, right? So this is something that happens a lot in postmodernism. And so we call it appropriation. It's where you take possession of someone else's image, often without permission, and you reuse it in a different way. So you change the meaning, you give it new meaning. And that's the big deal about it's, what's the difference between copy and appropriation is that the new person gives it new meaning. You have to transform the image, right? You transform the image. So what are some of the elements that you see that were taken from popular culture? What are some of the things that you see from popular culture? Raphael, can you give me one?
I would say the posters.
Sorry, can you say it louder?
The posters in the wall and like.
Right. So the poster on the wall actually comes from a comic or like a comic book. So it looks like a movie poster. It looks like some sort of poster. But when you look at it carefully, it's actually from a comic strip. Anything else? How about Juana?
I see like something from a food ad, like a lollipop.
Yep, it's got Tootsie. It's a Tootsie Pop. He's holding a Tootsie Pop, you know, with the Tootsie Roll in the center, right? We have a bodybuilder. He looks like he's been cut out from like a magazine, doesn't he? Or like a newspaper, and he's holding a Tootsie Pop. Look at the rug. That's a Jackson Pollock painting on the rug, right? That tells us how popular those abstract expressionist paintings were. Like people knew, like common everyday people probably saw on the news that stupid painter who like was making those horrible, ugly paintings, right? Like this was in the mindset of the common everyday American person, right? They would have seen him spotlighted on the news. They would have seen it in Life magazine or Time magazine, things like that. But there's all different kinds of things. The ceiling is the moon, right? Because we got the moon landing taking place soon, right? We've got theater, right? This one is my favorite. This is a woman using a vacuum in a staircase, right? So this is a really silly ad over here where a woman is, her life is so much better because she has this wonderful vacuum, right? We've got Can Can, we've got a pinup woman, we've got a Ford sign from a car. There's all of these things that come from advertisement in newspapers, magazines, TV, right? That are all kind of collaged together to create this image, right? And so that leads to Marilyn Monroe's Diptych by Andy Warhol. Okay, so Andy Warhol was an extremely prolific and important artist. He was working from pretty much the 1960s all the way through the 80s when he died. He was someone also who was known in popular culture. I remember him as a child on the news. I remember him going to the first WrestleMania. I know you guys, I don't know if you even know what WrestleMania is, but there used to be, you know, he was on the news all the time and always kind of in the New York scene. He was always at the most important get-togethers and so on. And so he created a series of works based on recognizable images. And probably one of his best known pieces is based on Marilyn Monroe, right? So let's focus on how this is pop art, right? How is this pop art? What parts of this seem like it is based on popular culture? Who can help me out? Isabella, can you help me?
It uses the image of like Marilyn Monroe.
So, what did you say about the image? I'm sorry.
It just uses like the image of Marilyn Monroe.
Right? So Marilyn Monroe was a famous actress, right? A famous actress. And I should say that this painting, I think, was made 4 months after she died. Right? 4 months after she died. So that's probably important to know. Besides the fact that it is an image of a popular movie actress, is there anything else about it that seems like it's kind of based on those characteristics that we talked about of pop art? How would you characterize the color on the left side? How would you characterize? I'm coming closer to make the volume louder. Sorry, I apologize if I got too loud by the speaker there. How would you characterize the color of the left side? Jeffrey, can you help me out?
It's like,
Is it realistic?
no.
No, right? It's not realistic color, right? What colors did he use? Just kind of list them out.
Like purples and yellows.
Right, so we've got this pinkish, purplish color for her skin tone. We got bright yellow for her hair. And of course, she was like a platinum blonde, right? And so that's kind of like an artificial yellow color. Her hair was fake. She actually was a brunette. So her name was like Norma Jean something. Marilyn Monroe became her kind of like, it's not really her alter ego, but it became her stage name. And so she transformed how she looked, right? So she's got teal, right, clothing. She's got this orange sort of background. The color is very fake and artificial, right? It's almost like fake, sort of like makeup in a way, right? And then when you look at the right side, right, and look at the right side, what kind of color do we have here? We have no color, right? We've got black and white. So when we look at this, we see that it is an image that comes from popular culture and has this artificial sort of bright color. Now, we'll talk more about how it was made and like the meaning of it, but then this painting also has a lot of similarities with abstract expressionism. Pollock often worked in monumental scale. So he made really large paintings, and he would cover the entirety of the surface with a similar image. Okay, so remember how Jackson Pollock had all those strips all the way out to the edges of the painting? Here, he works canvas to canvas, like to the canvas edges, all with a similar image, and he fills it up, right? He fills it up. There's no focal point, right? There's no place for our eye to really land, and there's no visual depth, right? There's no visual depth. So how was it made, right? How was it made? This was made with what we call serigraphy, right? This is a printmaking process where you basically are able to create a stencil on a piece of screen and print it over and over and over again. This is how t-shirts typically are printed on. So anytime you get a school shirt that has the Husky logo on it or the Red Hawk logo on it, it's typically printed onto the t-shirt. And this is that same method. So Warhol in New York City had something called the factory. And so the factory was where he and a group of other artists, they were basically his assistants, would make these paintings. So a lot of the work was actually not done by Warhol. He would kind of oversee it. He was the idea guy, right? He was the idea guy. He might do some touch-ups and be part of the process, but a lot of times these things were made by other people. And they would use the serigraphy method to print the image over and over and over again, right? So when you look at the right side, he did not print it the same way over and over again. What happens to the image on the right side? What happens on that black and white side? Jasmine, can you help me? What happens on that right side?
It kind of looks like it got smudged and like some of the images are not clear.
Right, so that second row in particular looks like it's smudged. And what happens to the imagery as we move to the right? What happens over here on the far right side?
It gets really faint.
Right, so keeping in mind that this was done 4 months after she died, why might he have altered the technique on that right side? Any ideas? Eva, do you have any ideas why he would change the method in which he printed it and made her look like she smeared and faded?
To represent her death.
to represent her death, but also maybe the disappearance of her memory, right? She was really popular. This was her popular persona on the right, on the left side, right? She was bright, she was bubbly, she was the center of all attention, but she was also fake, right? It was not who she really was. It was her public image. And then after she, she basically died of an overdose in her 40s, at an age where most women start to age and are not deemed as beautiful by popular culture. I did that in quotation marks. Hopefully you guys all saw my earphones. And we see that after her death, maybe her memory fades, maybe her beauty fades, maybe, it just represents her death. But he intentionally transformed the way that we see her image. So the image that we have is based on a photo from Some Like It Hot, which is a movie that she was made. And so it was maybe like it was a photo, but it also could have been a photo that she would have signed her autograph on. So it would have been an image people would recognize, right? People would have seen it before. And not all of Warhol's works are done this way, but for this image of Marilyn series, he intentionally used religious imagery. This is one that's in our textbook, right? Can you see how this looks like a Byzantine altarpiece on the left? How is the left piece Byzantine-like? Emily, can you help me? What is the stuff around her head? Can you tell? Might be the projection. It's gold. So he used gold paint to make it seem like this is an altar to Marilyn. And then when we look at the Marilyn diptych, right, it's in the name. What were diptychs often used for? Diptychs, triptychs, politics. What were they often used for? Think about your Morocco altarpiece, your Byzantine altarpiece. I just said altarpiece, right? It has a common format that we would see for a religious altar. Right? So good comparisons here in this work for like religious symbolism. So it's the religion of popular culture. It's holding up these people as if they are godlike, right? These are like your TikTok people today. Okay, I'm now making myself seem really old, right? So people from popular culture. He also made a lot of other images, which I think is really funny because a lot of times when we see pop culture images, they seem very light-hearted. But the Marilyn Monroe one is not lighthearted, is it? Like he has some emotional content to it as well. He also did a lot on the race riots. So this is based on Birmingham, Alabama. So he would take like magazine or newspaper images and blow them up on big canvases. Sometimes they're not just in black and white, sometimes they're in color too. And he'd often do it in a series. So he was talking about a lot of the same things we see in our own news and our own popular culture today. He was talking about in the 60s and 70s. But he's probably best known for these more lighthearted pieces. So here's like Elvis. Here's Campbell's soup can. He was obsessed with Campbell's soup. He actually ate it every day for lunch. His mother lived with him, and she would make it for him for lunch every single day. He would print his own packaging. So these are Brillo pads, they're scrub pads. And he would make the boxes and create installations of them as well as the Campbell soups. So it almost looked like it belonged in a grocery store, just kind of like some odd things that he considered to be art, right? Other artworks of pop art, right, is that this is Lichtenstein, sorry, hit the wrong button. This is Lichtenstein, and he would use Vendée dots. Vendée dots are basically how a lot of newspapers print color magenta, cyan, yellow, and black to print all these other colors. And so when you look at it, it looks kind of flat, but when we look at them up close, they're actually based on a series of dots. This one is a little bit more obvious. You can see the dots in her skin tone, right? And so what Wittgenstein often did is he would use kind of like poignant moments in comic strips to kind of make these large monumental paintings. And they tend to be like very melodramatic, over dramatic, like, I don't care. I'd rather sing than call Brad for help, right? So it's almost like a soap opera, like kind of scenario. So sometimes they really do just look like they're ripped from comic strips. Sometimes they're in a series, and sometimes they're shown all by themselves. A lot of his later works are very, like the Venn dots are just gigantic, and they almost look like pointillism, like Seurat. Right? And so the last piece that we have for this quiz is also pop art. And this is by Claes Oldenburg, and it's called Lipstick Ascending on Caterpillar Tracks. So number 150 in your note takers. Okay. Does anyone know who the patrons of Lipstick on Caterpillar Tracks were and where it was placed? Does anyone do some of the pre-reading for this? Does anyone know where this is placed? Any volunteers in the chat? Okay. This was requested by a group of students at Yale University. So this actually is located at Yale. It was originally to be placed in front of the university president's office, right? So a group of architectural students hired Claes Oldenburg to make this monument to the Second American Revolution, right? The Second American Revolution was the protest of the 1960s. So we have a group of activist students, commissioning artists, right, for the protest movement of the 60s at Yale. And it was to be placed next to a World War I memorial. Now, it was not meant to be permanent. It was not something that they thought would stay there because, of course, if it was a protest piece, it was going to be controversial, right? And they didn't necessarily think that it would be kept in front of the president's office forever and ever, right? So it was not made to be permanent. It did become permanent. We'll talk about that later. Right? So in its original context, right? In its original context, what it was is this, it kind of is like an abstract tape, right? So when you look at the very base of it, it has the tracks that you see for a tape, then like a cube. And then coming from the top of it, it basically has an inflatable lipstick, right? Had an inflatable lipstick. And so this is part of that like non-permanent sort of element to it, is that it was made out of kind of a soft material, and then it would inflate with air, and then it would deflate. Does anyone know why he would use a lipstick and a tank? What could be your symbolism? This is a little tricky. Does anyone know what that could possibly mean? What could a tank symbolize? Alana, can you help me out? What could a tank symbolize?
Maybe the military?
The military, very good. So the tank would be aggression. It could be government. It could be the military, right? And of course, there's a lot of anti-war stuff sentiment. In the 60s, we have the beginning of the, we have the Cold War, but we also have the beginning of the Vietnam War, right? Taking place in the 60s. So we have war and aggression, things that are often deemed very masculine. And so then lipstick, right? Lipstick is very feminine, but also fakeness to it or trying to pretty it up. You guys know what I mean by that? Pretty it up, right? Make it look better than it actually is. So it could be, right, kind of symbolic of trying to glorify war and make it seem more heroic than it actually is. Because in World War I, which this monument was right next to, it devastated Europe. 100,000 Americans died in that war, right? It was not a good war, right? It was the renewal, or excuse me, the creation of like modern warfare. It was a horrible war, right? And so it's kind of like this idea that we glorify war. And so they're making a statement about it. And even the fact that this is inflatable, right, where it would become erect and then flaccid, kind of has this kind of male connotation of like taking away power, right? So it actually has a sexual kind of imagery to it as well. So it was made to be not permanent, and so it was not meant to stay there, but it became so popular, and Oldenburg was, you know, a pretty famous architect or sculptor eventually. And so what they did is they made it more permanent. So the lipstick stays erect and it's made out of metal now. So they got rid of the inflatable component to this piece. So it's like that now. Oldenburg does a lot of these, what we call soft sculptures. So the fact that this was inflatable is, you know, called a soft sculpture there. And so often there's a component to that. This is a set of drums, which is kind of ironic, right? So it's no longer hard. It cannot make the sound. It looks deflated. This thing on the right side is an old-fashioned telephone. But he's probably best known for these large-scale pieces. This one is a hot water bottle bag that's animated. This moves as well, like lipstick. But what you probably know is some of these really large outdoor pieces. There's a famous one by the Willis Tower of a baseball bat. You may have seen that in the city. But giant clothespin, maybe the spoon in Minneapolis. This is outside the Walker Museum, a very famous art museum in Minneapolis, right? Here is kind of a combined image of popular culture, right? Swiss Army knife with kind of a boat. And then some of my favorite ones are where they kind of interact with the landscape. So this is on the campus of a university, and it's basically a notebook that has been caught in the wind. So it has these, it's all anchored into the ground, but looks like paper is being ripped from it and then being like, you know, flying away in the park. The last group that we have is people like Hansen, who would do these kind of large installations of people. And so he would make people seem like they're kind of like anonymous or kind of like they kind of lack their life. And so there's a lot of these installation scenes where sometimes they have props and settings and sometimes they don't. They're kind of almost frozen and kind of stuck in time. So that is the end of what we need for the quiz. Any questions on modern art? Any questions on modern art? Okay, so we will have a quiz. So make sure to fill in your note takers. Okay, we are going to move on. This was not in the homework, but we are going to go ahead and get started with it just to ensure that we have plenty of time. So I think this is like study guide 120, if I remember right. We're going to look at installation and earth art. So we're going to start first in Central Park. I don't want to take a lot of time on this, but you might know that Central Park in New York City is kind of a controversial park. On the island of Manhattan, you know, it was in the 1800s, was obviously an up and coming city in the world. And it really lacked park space. And so the city of New York basically commandeered a bunch of property. There used to be neighborhoods in this area, and so they demolished neighborhoods to create a park for people to enjoy, right? And so it's actually an artificial park. Everything about this is not natural. So it's kind of like an English garden in a way. It was manicured in order to look this way. It was done by a very popular landscape architect named Olmsted. He's actually the same architect who did the Columbian exhibition in Jackson Park in Chicago. So where the campus of the Science and Industry building is, and where the new Obama library is going to be, this is the same location in Chicago, right? So basically what he did is he created, like, there's a road underneath Central Park, there's all this irrigation and piping that goes to other parts of the city, dug underneath of the park itself, and they created all these places. So here at the end, you can see that there are a bunch of baseball fields and kind of open places. There's a lake that they created, and there's also formal gardens. A lot of the places you've seen on TV, or if you've ever been there yourself, they're all kind of set up there for people's personal enjoyment. And the reason I bring it up is that this has been an incredibly popular place for artists to install their artwork. So not only is it itself a artwork, right, or a installation like a landscape art like cart, it also is a place where art is often shown. And so we have a term that's very common in the 20th and 21st century, and it's called an installation. So this is a vocabulary term you should probably write down, right? This is art that is or has been installed, arranged in a place, either by an artist or specified by the artist. So often the artist will give directions on how to set up their work, and it's made to go up a certain way so that the viewer can experience it in a very specific way, right? Sometimes an installation is very site specific, which means it's only made for that one location. But then other installations can be set up in different places and have similar meaning. Sometimes the installations even are set up intentionally to have different meaning. Installations can be indoors or outdoors. And most of the time, installations are meant to be temporary. They normally aren't there forever and ever. There are a few that are permanent. Right? So another term that we have, actually, let me pause you for a second, make sure you guys have that. Another term that often goes hand in hand with installation is site-specific. So what is site-specific art? This is art that's created for a certain place. So it's meant for a certain location. Typically, the artist takes into consideration the location when planning and creating the work of art. So they think about how it will be perceived in that particular location, right? So our first artist works in installation as well as site-specific work, and her name is Yayoi Kusuma, right? And so if you look her up, I'm going to actually just hit this link to save some time. You'll see that she is really known for her polka dots. She's a Japanese artist that's still working today, and she is known for her installations and her polka dots. And so she does pieces that are painted, but she also has these monumental indoor installations. And when she started working in the 1960s, she made a piece that we called, which is 148, which is called Narcissus Garden. So does anyone know first who Narcissus is, or what narcissism is? Does anyone know who Narcissus was or what narcissism is?
Wasn't he this Greek guy from the story who like died looking at the water's mirror's reflection of himself?
Yes. He was so enamored by his own appearance that he fell in and drowned in the water. So yes, it's a Greek myth, a Greek story. So narcissism is this idea of kind of like self-love, right? So that has just a little bit of an idea of what this imagery is all about, right? So how does setting and objects reflect the story, right? How does object and setting reflect the story, right? So let's look first at what these objects are made of. What do they appear to be made out of? They look like they're made out of mirrored metal balls, don't they? They look like they're made out of mirrored metal balls. Originally, these were made out of shiny plastic balls, and I'll explain that in just a little bit. But they have a mirror-like quality to that. So you can see reflection of whatever you see next to it into that mirrored surface. So that idea of the reflection in the water. And then in her installation, where is she setting them up? Inside a body of water. Now, this is not the ocean. This is not a lake. She installs them in ponds and waters in probably parks or like outside corporations. So, you know, like big giant retention ponds. So these are in water sources that are pretty tame. Right? So she did not make these globes herself. She had them mass produced in factories. So just like Donald Judd in Minimalism would buy and use industrial materials, she too bought these mirrored, at first, like I said, plastic balls, but then later she would make these kind of metal chrome balls. She had them mass produced for her, and then she installed them for her purpose. Right? So this piece is an act of conceptual art. So just like, this is a great continuity and change element in our 250, is just like Duchamp, she would buy these objects or have these objects fabricated, and then she would make them into art, right? She would transform them. It's about her idea. Like she didn't do too much to this other than buy a certain quantity of them and then put them in the water. Right? Or make the directions for how they would be installed in the water. She was, you know, not necessarily setting all of these installations up. It's based on the concept, not the making, right? So when this was first shown as an artwork, it was not actually a site-specific installation, right? It was actually a performance piece. So like I mentioned with Robert Rauschenberg, is that these kind of performance pieces had interaction between an artist and the audience. And you didn't necessarily have to always have a script. So what she did is she went to the Venice Biennial. It's a major art exhibition that's held every single year or every 2 years. And so what they would do is each country kind of brings their best artists of the day, and they put up an art kind of presentation, a display for each country. And so she was not formally invited. She would not have been just handpicked. So instead, on the outside of the biennial, she had this series of these plastic chrome balls, and she would try to sell it to the people going inside the art show, right? So she actually sold them for not really 2 pounds, it was 2 lira, right? So before euros, it was like 2 lira, which wasn't a lot of money. Why would she sell them so cheap? What kind of statement could she be making about selling some art really cheap next to a really prestigious art show? Any ideas? Maybe any educated guesses?
Not really.
I don't really know.
Really? How expensive do artwork sell for? Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars, right? And so she was thinking about art being in the form of a commodity. Art is a commodity that is sold, right? And art can only be like bought by the uber wealthy. So she was trying to make art that could be sold to the masses, right? That more people could afford to buy art. So not everyone who goes to these major art exhibitions can afford the work inside of them, right? Some people just go to look because they're interested in art. So she first, like I said, made these out of plastic and later chrome. And actually now today, if you were to go buy one of these original, they actually are sold in galleries for hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is of course the opposite of what she wanted this piece to be about, right? So this is based on what we call a happening. So this is an active performance that basically planned. So she knew she was going here to sell these liras. So she had all these interactions with all of the people who would come to the art display. So there's a sense of spontaneity and improvisation. She's being kind of a show person. She's, you know, being a salesperson, trying to sell these things. So she would, you know, there's a kind of a participation between her and the audience. And it's always different based on whoever her next client is purchasing or declining the purchase of one of these profiles. So it first started as a performance, and then later it became this installation of water. So we have it in the 250 as an installation in water, but the first time it was shown, it was still Narcissus Garden. It was a performance piece. So is her work site specific, right? Was it made for one location? Probably not, right? It's probably not site specific because this display has been at Central Park, which we talked about. It's been in Venice. It's been in Washington, D.C. I actually saw on the news it was going to be somewhere else. Like they're installing it like now somewhere else in the United States. I wish I could remember where, right? So it's sort of site specific. In her plans, she said that it has to be installed in a pond or a reflecting pool to get across the idea. So there's some parameters that have to be met in order for this to be displayed the way she wants. So we need a reflecting pond. It should be placed in a wealthy city, right? It has to be displayed in a wealthy city. They're not going to put it in the middle of nowhere, right? They're going to put it in a major power city, New York, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Paris, Brussels, right? Somewhere like that. It needs to be an area of commerce for the meeting to happen because art is a commodity. It is something that is bought and sold. So location is important. And when we think about the location, we also have to keep in mind that weather and the water impacts the meaning. So the weather and the water would impact the meaning because these balls free float in the water. They're not held together by nets. They're not tethered inside the pond. They're allowed to go wherever they want. So they reflect ever-changing viewpoints. So just like how our persona of what is art changes, right? Or what the price of art changes, right? It's a commodity. It goes up and down, right? But also, of course, how it reflects our vainness as well. So when we look at these, right, besides that, we have to think about that reflection. So you could see yourself in this. A good example of it is Cloud Gate in Chicago. You guys probably know of it as a beam, right? It's not a flat mirror. So just like this is not a flat mirror, it creates a distortion of reality. So that kind of warped narcissist view of ourselves, right? So that's a really complex piece, right? It's talking about money. It's talking about commerce. It's talking about expensive art. It's talking about art for the masses. It's about art for location. It's got a lot of meaning as well as personal. Right? This is probably going to be a little bit old, but Kusuma has made these infinity rooms that were really popular. I think Adele sang in one. I've seen a lot of pictures on social media of people inside these. And so it's basically a series of lights and rooms with mirrors. And of course, because it's mirrors, it creates a sense of infinity where the space goes on and on and on forever. Right? And then the last group that we're going to look at today are also site specific. And this is Christo and Jeanne, what's her name? Sorry, I can't believe I forgot her name. And Jeanne-Claude. So this is a husband and wife group that does these large scale installations. And so this is called fences. There was a series of fences in Japan and in California at the very same time. So basically on two sides of the Pacific, they had these fences and they would run kind of the natural landscape and kind of end it in the water. So here you can see how it goes into the water. So it kind of enunciates or kind of it makes the natural landscape kind of stand out. However, because it's called fences, right? Fences are borders, so they can be symbolic of you shall not pass, you shall not cross into another area. This is a canyon crossing that they created. So what's important to know about Christo and Jeanne-Claude is that their pieces are all about the process. There is an end product, right? There is an end product, but for them, the process of having something this big created is their art form. So they are involved in all parts of it. So they often get all of their funds for this based on selling the plans. So they don't actually make money off of the final installation. All of that is kind of done for free. They raise the money for these things to be made. They basically make plans, they photograph the process, and they're often displayed in sold in art galleries or just on display in museums. So what they will do is they'll go to city planning meetings, right? And they'll get the government involved. They, like I said, they don't, they basically create like local groups that solicit the money for these things to be built, rather than they don't really profit off of them at all, or at least they did used to profit. I know Jeanne-Claude passed away. I feel like Christo passed away too. I could be wrong on that. But this is based on a famous series of where they went to Florida and they covered the outside of some islands in this pink, this like really artificial bubblegum pink plastic. They did a series of umbrellas, once again, in Japan and California. Sadly, somebody died, I think, in Japan. One of these fell over because each of them were thousands of pounds and fell and landed on someone. So they have some controversy as well. They've covered bridges in material. They've covered governmental buildings. Now, this looks like it's fake, but this is actually a German governmental building that they covered. So it made this government building obsolete because you couldn't even get inside of it when this was installed. And the piece that's in the 250 is called the Gates. So this too is was in Central Park in New York City. So this art is about the process, right? So once again, the process of the installation of the pieces was considered the art by the artist. So the planning, they researched the flow of pedestrian traffic. So they really focused on how people move through and out the park, right? Because that's where they wanted to put the gates. They wanted to put the gates in places where people would experience it. They wanted it to represent how people move and navigate through the park itself, right? They did all the fundraising and selling of the plans. And then they went to governmental and zoning meetings. So they would go and make presentations at these meetings. So this is them in front of this large screen presenting to the people of New York. This was decades in the making. It was not something that happened in a couple of years. This took decades of convincing that to the city of New York that this should happen. So the image on the right here is a plan. And then we can see how they mapped out where they were going to put all of these gates. So they hired a company to fabricate the gates. They made the metal posts. They made the fabric. They installed it into the park, right? They hired the crew. They oversaw the installation, and they also oversaw it being disassembled. So when it was done, they had to take it all apart, and they were there to witness that too, and to make sure it worked out for them. Right? So let's just focus on something really basic. What is a gate and what is it used for? What is a gate? Cora, what's a gate?
Well, you walk through it. Yeah.
You do, you walk through it. So a gate is something that you walk through. Normally it's connected to a fence and you have to open it up to go into another area, right? This is not that kind of gate, right? Instead, it's basically a post and lintel, right? It's a post and lintel with a flag. It's almost more like gates that you see through, right? Any skiers in the group, right? You've ever seen skiing the downtown? You know how they have to pitch and make it through the gates and make it through all those little flags, right? So as the viewer, as the participant in the park, how are you meant to interact with the art? What do you think you need to do? You walk through it, right? You walk through it and you see the orange fabric billowing, right? Right? Orange is often considered a peaceful color, right? An inclusive color. It's actually, I think, why our district changed its logo from green to orange, because it is a peaceful, contemplative, inclusive color. I think that is a concept that comes from Hinduism, if I remember right. So people would come to New York City, they would walk through the path, right? And they would kind of walk through it. And so in a way, it channels people. Like people were kind of like forced to obey the path. It doesn't mean that in a park, people always stick to the sidewalk, right? Sometimes people make a beeline and cross through the grass and whatnot. So in a way, they were actually making a commentary on how this park is fake, right? This is not a natural park, and they are, right, forcing people to walk through the park an unnatural way for them, because people want to follow the directions, they want to walk through the gates, right? So you can see that this really did cover up a majority of Central Park. You can see all those orange flags in this, or all those orange gates, I should say, in this aerial photo. Right, so talking about the unnaturalness of the park itself. And then, like I said, Jeanne-Claude passed away. And the last thing that I heard about they were in the process of trying to do was to wrap the Arch of Triumph in Paris. But I think it got slowed down because of COVID. I think it was supposed to happen last February or this February. Okay, we're going to stop there. I did have a video about the gates, but I don't know where it went. It was from The Daily Show. It might have gotten lost. Oh, I guess it is. So I guess I'll let you guys go. Quiz on Wednesday. Make sure you get your notes filled out before you take the quiz, because those are meant to be study aids. you have questions, feel free to ask any way out. Hi, everyone.